Today we're going to read one of my favorite picture books, and I read it every year. Most of the time, I try to read it during Black History Month, which is now February. Um, but I want to read this one before we start our next read aloud because I think it will help us understand a little bit more of our next read aloud. This book is called Ruth and the Green Book, and all the time that I have read a book aloud to you and recorded it, we have been able to look at the book on the Kindle reader on my computer. The problem with this book is the words are tiny. So I'm actually going to read to you from my copy of the book, but I'll put the pictures up. You'll see maybe you can see the words. I can't. Whether that means my eyesight is not great, which it isn't, or it just means I'm old, which I'm not. I don't know. But I will not be able to read from the screen. One thing I do want to do is talk to you a little bit about what the Green Book is, but I want to do that at the end of the book. I promise not to waste a lot of your time, but I do want you to stick around and hear that part. So this is Ruth and the Green Book. I love the pictures in this book. All right, here we go. It was a big day at our house when Daddy drove up in our very own automobile, a 1952 Buick. It is the most beautiful color. Daddy calls it sea mist green. He bought it for his new job, but first we planned to go on a trip to visit Grandma in Alabama. I was so excited to travel across the country. I packed my own bag, and Mama said I could take Brown Bear with me for company, even though I'm almost too old for him. As we drove out of Chicago, it felt funny to see the neighborhood disappear, and then the streets, and then the buildings. I love all the green grass and hills and trees. Daddy told lots of stories about when he was a boy in Alabama. He made us laugh. Eventually, we stopped and had a picnic lunch that Mama had packed. She had been cooking all week to get ready for the trip. After driving for a long time, we stopped at a service station to fill up on gas. As Daddy was paying the station attendant, Mama asked for the key to the restroom. The man said we couldn't use the restroom because they were for whites only. Mama and I had to go into the woods. I was embarrassed, but Mama said the people who should be ashamed of themselves were those service station owners. I was tired when Daddy stopped the automobile. I asked Mama where we were, and she said we were going to spend the night in a real hotel. We watched Daddy talking to the man behind the desk. Daddy was smiling and pointing to us, but the man shook his head and turned his back. Daddy came back out and slammed the car door. He never slammed the door before, so I knew he was mad. I wondered what happened, but I knew somehow it wasn't a good time to ask him. Mama gave me a look that said, "Ruth, just keep quiet." So that's what I did. We kept on driving through the night. Mama took a turn so Daddy could sleep. I fell asleep with Brown Bear as my pillow. We must have pulled off the road in the middle of the night because when I woke in the morning we were all curled up in the car. I was stiff and hungry. Mama gave us cold biscuits and jam for breakfast. She said we should sing to cheer ourselves up. We sang a lot that day as we crossed the country. We had picnics at roadside stops for lunch and dinner because all the restaurants had signs in the window that said we couldn't eat there. It seemed like there were white-only signs everywhere outside of our Chicago neighborhood. I felt homesick, and I hugged Brown Bear close all day. When we crossed into Tennessee, Daddy said his friend Eddie lived close by. He was sure we could sleep there. Eddie was so happy to see us. He gave me a big hug and told me that he knew me when I was real little. His wife, Alice, cooked us a warm meal, and I ate too much. Daddy and Eddie used to play music in a band before they went off and fought in the war. They talked about how they traveled a lot back then and how they always had a hard time finding places to rest and eat. Daddy shook his head and said he had hoped that the war had changed things, but now he could see he was wrong. That night I went to sleep to the sound of Daddy and Eddie playing music together. Brown Bear and I were happy to sleep in a real bed with a real pillow. The next day, as we loaded the car, I heard Eddie talking quietly to Mama and Daddy. Eddie warned them about what was ahead, someone called Jim Crow. I heard Eddie tell them that however bad it was so far, it was only going to get worse for us, maybe even dangerous as we went farther south. Then Eddie saw me listening, and he picked me up and told me not to worry. He said that I should look out for Esso service stations along the road, because the people there would be nice to us. In the car, I asked Daddy who Jim Crow was, and he explained that Jim Crow wasn't a who. It was a bunch of ugly laws forbidding blacks and whites from mixing in any way. I asked, why don't they want our business? Wasn't our money just the same? It hurt my feelings to be so unwelcome. But Mama sighed and reminded me that my job that day was to look for an Esso station. I spotted an Esso station near the Georgia border and sang out for Daddy to stop. Daddy filled the car up and asked the man if he knew where we could sleep for the night. The man showed us a pamphlet called The Negro Motorist Green Book. Explained very quickly. Once again, we talked about this in the last book that we read, but in the 1950s, 1960s, Negro was the appropriate and polite word to use for African Americans. Negro is not the N word that is an inappropriate word that we don't use. So I want to be very clear about that. Okay, so this pamphlet is called The Negro Motorist Green Book. He explained the book was started by a postman, Mr. Victor H. Green, to help Black people who were traveling. It lists places in lots of states where we would be welcome to sleep, to eat, to shop, to get a haircut, and all kinds of other information besides. Right away, Daddy bought our very own copy for 75 cents. Mama read about a place nearby called a tourist home, where we could stay for the last night of our trip. Daddy called ahead, and sure enough, the lady told us to come right away. Then Mama gave me the green book and said I was in charge of keeping it. I couldn't stop reading it, all those places in all those states where we could go and not worry about being turned away. We reached the tourist home in the early evening. Mrs. Melody, the owner, gave us a big smile when she opened the door. It was like coming home. And she wouldn't even let Daddy pay her. She said she welcomed Negro travelers because it was right to help each other out. I'm going to do the same one day. The next morning I hated to say goodbye to Mrs. Melody, but Daddy said we could be at Grandma's house that evening, and that made me happy to get going again. It wasn't so easy, though. Our automobile broke down about midday in the middle of nowhere. People drove right past. I felt empty in the pit of my stomach. I hugged Brown Bear and wished we were already at Grandma's house. But Mama said not to worry. We could figure this out. She unfolded our map and told me the names of nearby towns. She said, Ruth, look in the green book and see if you can find a place in one of those towns that will fix our car. And I did. Daddy gave me a big hug, and then he walked into town to find the garage that would help us. By the time we got the car fixed, it was too late to reach Grandma's house that day, so I looked in the green book and picked out an inn nearby that said they welcomed Negro travelers. It was a big house with lots of rooms. Most of the people there were businessmen traveling for their jobs. They each carried a green book. They said they could never do their jobs without it. We met a salesman named Jason who has traveled to all of the states of the Union for his job. He told such funny stories. Mama laughed so hard she had tears rolling down her face. For the first time since we left home, we were really happy. At the inn, I met a little boy who was traveling with his mother. It was the first time he had ever left home, and I could just tell he was scared. I thought of Mrs. Melody, Victor Green, Eddie, and all the other people who had helped us. And then I decided to give Brown Bear to the boy. I told him that Brown Bear was a good traveler. I'm too old for Brown Bear now, and the little boy needed him more than I do. Then I told his mother about the Green Book and showed her our copy. That night, before I went to sleep, I thought about our trip. It was not what I had expected. Traveling could be scary, that's for sure. It made me sad that some people were mean to Negroes. But it helped to know that good black people all over the country had pitched in to help each other. I felt like I was part of one big family. Plus, tomorrow I would finally see Grandma and tell her what a great Green Book guide I had been. I don't know if you can see, that's Grandma, but there's a copy of the Green Book right there. So in the 1950s and 1960s, there was before the civil rights movement had happened, and as you can tell, African Americans were still not treated fairly in this country. Lots of places they weren't allowed to shop, not allowed to get gas, or they would take the money for the gas. They could get gas, but they weren't allowed to use the restrooms. They weren't allowed to go into restaurants or into some hotels. Um, I would say most of us have never been turned away from a store or a hotel or a restaurant or the use of a bathroom because of the color of our skin. So it's a little hard for us to imagine that it's not safe for us to go somewhere based on what we look like. But that still happens today. Unfortunately, lots of people are judged based on what they look like. And it's our job to watch out for people, and it's our job to help people when we can. um, like all of these people, the people that Miss Melody and Eddie and the guy at the Esso station and the guys who fixed the car, all of those people worked together to make sure that they had a safe trip to get where they went. And of course, Mr. Green, who created the Green Book, helped most of all because he let them know the places that were safe. I want to read a little bit of the history of the Green Book. There's a whole page in the back of this book. Obviously, I can't read that, but I want to tell you a little bit about it. So I'm going to read from my book. Just decades after the Emancipation Proclamation and the 13th Amendment ended slavery. So that was the speech that Abraham Lincoln gave to say that slavery was no longer legal in the United States. African Americans continued to suffer unequal treatment, especially in the South, where Jim Crow laws discriminated against blacks in nearly every aspect, including travel. Although the roads and highways were free for all to use, doing so was not easy for blacks. Most hotels and restaurants would not serve African Americans, and driving overnight often meant sleeping in cars and packing food to eat on the journey. Many gas stations would not sell gas to black drivers, so they had to carry gas cans and always be on the lookout for the few stations that would welcome their business. Even then, they might not be allowed to use the public restrooms. In 1936, an African American living in New York City named Victor Green wrote a book to help black travelers. He made a list of all the hotels, restaurants, gas stations, and businesses that would serve African Americans in his city. There was such a high demand for his book that he decided his next edition would include other towns and other states as well. The Green Book was sold for a quarter in 1940 at black-owned businesses and at Esso stations, which were among the only gas stations that sold to African Americans. Esso was owned by the Standard Oil Company, which eventually provided funding and offices for Victor Green. The Green Book quickly became very popular and helped many businessmen on the road, as well as families who needed and wanted to travel by car. By 1949, the price of the Green Book had grown along with its size. It cost 75 cents and was 80 pages long. It covered all of the United States, Bermuda, Mexico, and even Canada. In the 1950s and early 1960s, civil rights leaders like Martin Luther King Jr. brought national and international recognition to the injustices suffered by the African Americans. Jim Crow's days were numbered. On July 2, 1964, President Lyndon Johnson signed the Civil Rights Bill into law. Among other things, this act made it illegal for hotels, restaurants, and gas stations to discriminate against customers. So this meant they could no longer say they would only serve whites. They had to serve everyone. Green published the final edition of the Green Book that same year, 1964. His lifelong dream to see African American travelers treated equally was finally a reality. To view a copy of the real Green Book online, you can go to www.ruthandthegreenbook.com. And Ruth and the Green Book is the title of the book we just read. So, um, I love the story. It makes me sad because that was not so very long ago, unfortunately. And we still have a long way to go in this country to treating all people fairly. But I think the more we know about our history and the more we understand about people in general, the better chance we have of doing that in your lifetimes. You're in charge of doing that, okay? All right.